Bonnie and Clyde might be famous for their dozens of small-town robberies, but in retrospect, they were little fish. Their romanticized antics don't even come close to some of the industrial-sized thefts that have penetrated international banks, museums, and jewelry stores throughout the last 100 years. Through meticulous planning and organization and a deceptive plan of escape, these sensational real-life thieves exploited their victims for millions and sometimes billions of dollars, from banks in Bangladesh to the crown jewels of England. In the eyes of a heist-master, if something has a high value, it's got a target on its back. To be considered responsible for what's been dubbed the heist of the century, a significant amount of planning, coordination, and risk needs to take place. Routes need to be planted weeks, months, sometimes even years in advance. When Leonardo Notar Bartolo rented a sparsely furnished office in the Antwerp World Diamond Center, he wasn't running his own business or coordinating client meetings. He was establishing his headquarters for what would soon be one of the largest robberies in history. While stationed in the building, Leonardo's five-man team, known as the School of Turin, conducted detailed surveillances of the Diamond Center, observed guards opening the vault door, and recorded the combinations that they used with a small hidden camera. Then the thieves allegedly built their very own full-sized replica vault. On the weekend starting February 15, 2003, Leonardo and his fellow goons put their plan into action. With plastic gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, the group's so-called King of Keys picked the lock to an abandoned office building that adjoined the Diamond Center. From there, they bypassed cameras, cracked the combination dial, unlocked the door with a homemade key, and blocked the thermal motion sensors with hairspray. It took 2 hours to raid more than 100 of the 189 safety deposit boxes, before walking away with diamonds, gold, and jewelry valued at more than $100 million. Amazingly, not a single alarm was triggered, and the staff didn't even notice the robbery until they reopened on Monday morning. In the end, Leonardo was caught and sentenced to 10 years in prison, but the majority of the loot was never recovered. 13 years earlier, over in the Isabella Gardner Museum in Boston, the biggest cold case heist in history was underway. It took all of just 81 minutes for the single largest unsolved stolen art episode in modern America to play out. This plan was far less elaborate, yet just as successful. Just before midnight on March 18, 1990, two men pulled up to the side entrance of the Gardner Museum. After waiting an hour to ensure that no cops were on their tail, they emerged from their Dodge Daytona wearing cheap police officer costumes, fake mustaches and all, and succeeded in fooling the inexperienced night watchman into thinking that they were responding to a disturbance call. They weren't after money, they were after the near-priceless works of art that littered the museum's walls. Once inside, the duo tied up the guards and, with a blade, cut around the canvas's edges to remove the paintings from their casings. Among the works stolen were The Storm on the Sea of Galilee by Rembrandt, valued at $100 million, and The Concert by Vermeer, valued at around $300 million. All up, a successful haul of near enough to $500 million. Even 30 years after the heist, the museum is still on the hunt, eager to retrieve its masterpieces. They've even offered a reward of $10 million for anybody that provides key information which leads to the art's recovery. On August 8, 1963, a team of 15 robbers led by a man named Bruce Reynolds made off with £2.6 million. Accounting for inflation, that's around $55 million or close to $70 million American dollars. If you've seen the famous film called The Great Train Robbery, then you'll know the story. If you haven't, well, here's how one of the most ingenious heists in American history played out. A Royal Mail train was carrying Scottish and Irish currency as well as various valuables as it traversed its route along the countryside from Glasgow to London. When the train made it to the Britigo Railway Bridge in Ledburn, England, Bruce and his gang had already sprung into action. Ordinarily, the railway light would have been green and the conductor would have continued along on his merry way. But Reynolds had masked the green light and his co-conspirators had connected their own battery to power the red light instead. When the conductor saw red, the Royal Mail train was forced to make an unexpected stop. That's when the thieves outmuscled the conductor, climbed aboard, and robbed the locomotive of 120 sacks full of loot. 11 of the 15 men were eventually found and sentenced to time behind bars, but the majority of the money remained at large. From the railways to the skies, the only unsolved airborne piracy heist in American history was spearheaded by one man, D.B. Cooper. In 1971, Cooper, or at least that's the alias that he gave at the check-in desk, boarded a Boeing 727 on a Northwest Orient Airlines flight from Portland to Seattle. While in the air, he showed the flight attendant his homemade explosive device, although oddly enough, rather calmly and politely according to her recollection. Cooper demanded that the airline and the authorities provide 4 parachutes and $200,000 in $20 bills. After landing in Seattle, Cooper exchanged the flight's 36 passengers for his demands, then took off in a southerly direction, ordering the pilot to set a course for Mexico City. However, it wasn't until the plane stopped to refuel in Reno, Nevada that the crew realized that Cooper had fled. He parachuted somewhere over the Pacific Northwest, never to be seen again. It's not often that you hear about groundbreaking crimes taking place over in Scandinavia. But back in 2009, the police force in Stockholm, Sweden's capital, found themselves knee-deep trying to solve the country's first-ever helicopter robbery. After a Bell 206 helicopter was stolen from the Roslagens helicopter base in the early hours of the morning, the crew of thieves flew down to Stockholm, landing on the roof of the G4S cash service building. Using a sledgehammer and small explosives to blow security doors open, the perps were in and out of the building in 20 minutes, flying away with 39 million Swedish kronor. 7 men were sentenced to varying prison terms in October of 2010 for their participation in the helicopter heist, and ordered to spend between 1 and 8 years behind bars. Staff at Harry Winston's exclusive jewelry store in Paris got one hell of a fright when 4 men dressed as women started herding customers and workers into a corner, smashing the display cases, and then speeding off with almost 85 million pounds worth of diamonds. That's about 105 million US dollars worth. The men belonged to the audacious Pink Panthers gang, who had mounted well-planned and elaborate robberies around the world for years, mostly in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. You'd assume that 105 million would have been enough of a stash, but just 4 years later in 2013, they took it to the next level. One solitary Pink Panthers member, alleged to be a man named Milan Poparik, walked into a diamond exhibition hosted by Israeli billionaire Lev Lviv at the Carton Hotel in Cannes, France. In the end, the robbery was easy because the jewels were poorly protected and the guards were unarmed. The perp made away with 72 jewels with an estimated value of 110 million pounds, or 138 million US dollars. To this day, questions are still left unanswered. Conventional heists involve brick-and-mortar stores, an elaborate get-in and get-out plan, and usually disguises and weapons. When Bangladesh's central bank was robbed of more than $80 million in 2018, it was through a very different set of means. Digital means. On the evening of Thursday, February 4th, 2016, most of the central bank staff had gone home for the weekend. That's when the thieves struck. Hackers managed to install a malicious program on the bank's computer systems, likely through an infected email that a staff member would have previously opened. Clicking on that email would have unintentionally downloaded the malware which stole the bank's passwords and credentials. The hackers then used the bank's information to access SWIFT, the international messaging system used to send money around the world. Via SWIFT, 35 requests, which totaled almost $1 billion, were generated to transfer funds from Bangladesh to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and through to RCBC, a bank in the Philippines. Only 3 of these requests were approved, but that was still enough for $81 million to be stolen. We've all heard of the crown jewels of England, right? Well, did you know that they were actually stolen almost 400 years ago? A man named Thomas Blood was an Irish assassin who decided that his next career move was going to be theft. Not just anyone can view the crown jewels, though, especially a no-name foreigner. So Thomas Blood gave himself a fake illustrious title, wore a high-class costume, and hired people to play the role of his fake wife and fake nephew, claiming that said nephew would marry the daughter of Talbot Edwards, the keeper of the jewels. Once he'd secured a private viewing of the jewels, the gang knocked Talbot out, smashed the jewels' casing with mallets, and shoved them in their pants before making a run for it. It wasn't too long before they were chased down, though, with several guards allegedly tackling them off their horses. While this certainly wasn't the most successful heist in history, it's certainly up there with the most famous of them all. Sometimes these fascinating high-stakes crimes are the most of criminal circles, and other times they're the work of a lone wolf, or at least to begin with. A perfect example is the diabolical cyber theft carried out in the hands of Alexander Andreevich Panin. Also known as Gribodemon or Harder Man, this Russian hacker was responsible for creating a malicious software dubbed SpyEye, which he then distributed in underground online forums for $500 a pop. Beginning in 2010, SpyEye cracked into computer systems and collected bank accounts, credit card numbers, and passwords, with over 1.4 million people affected. SpyEye infiltrated banks and ATMs in China, Germany, Russia, and the USA. One US official described Alexander's malware empire to a T, quote, "He commercialized the wholesale theft of financial and personal information," end quote. We don't know exactly how much was stolen, but figures point upwards of $500 million, or even possibly well into the multi-billions. Panin was arrested and sentenced to 9 years and 6 months in prison, but there was no retrieving what was already gone. Around the same time that Panin was exploiting the online banking world, 2 of the world's biggest oil players, Shell and Eni, were involved in an exploit of their own. Subsidiaries of both of these companies allegedly paid the Nigerian government close to $1.1 billion for an offshore block called OPL 245. that had approximately 9 billion barrels worth in its reserves. Some 8 years later, the truth of the matter is still yet to be determined. However, many authorities and courts question whether Shell and Eni were aware that the billion-dollar fee they paid wasn't actually being sent to the government. Instead, it was sent to a ruse company called Malibu Oil and Gas, one which was controlled by the former Nigerian oil minister Dan Atete, a man who was already a convicted money launderer. Is this a heist of epic proportions interwoven with money laundering and international oil trade, or is it merely a case of misunderstanding? The jury is still out on this one. Were there any other heists that we hadn't mentioned that you think deserve a spot in our next video? Let us know. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and as always, thanks so much for checking out The Richest. We'll see you next time and have a great day.